if you test your satellites, if you try and minimize the impacts, we can all work together and we can save the natural night sky and save the scientific night sky and hopefully have the balance where we get this amazing technology and we can connect to the internet on our phones no matter where we are in the world, but we also keep all the astronomical, technological, social, environmental benefits that we get.
Hey SpaceWatchers, this is Space Café Radio, your channel about trends, awesome events and interesting people in the space sector. Today we will talk about our night sky and why we hear more and more voices that raise their concerns that pushing initiatives to preserve the sky. With currently over 10,000 active satellites mainly in LEO, low Earth orbit, we have artificial objects that, despite their purpose, such as communication or Earth observation satellite, start to disturb astronomers, start to disturb science. On one hand, we have the technological advancements from the satellites. On the other hand, we have the environmental impact. How to balance that? How to find a way forward? Or is humanity on its track that we have been with the oceans? I will try to shed some light into the dark on this topic. Non-polluting, of course. My guest is Ian Muirhead from the University of Manchester. I'm Thorsten Krinning, publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. Lean back and enjoy this episode. Hey SpaceWatchers, and welcome back. Today I have the great pleasure to talk with Ian Muirhead. And Ian, how are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Thank you, Thorsten, and thank you very much for inviting me on this show today.
Ian, can you please tell us what are you doing?
Yeah, so I'm a researcher in the Space Systems Research Group at the University of Manchester. My own research is very much focused on the development of very low Earth orbit telecommunications constellations, orbiting below about 450 kilometers. But I'm particularly interested in the darker, quiet skies problem and the impacts of developing space economy on terrestrial astronomy. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. I couldn't make a better introduction into the topic. So why do we need the dark skies? Let's start with this very easy question. If I'm going out in the evening, I want to see some stars, I want to see some movement and don't want to have this boring night sky. So tell me, how is the response from an astronomer on that?
So it's a fantastic question. It's one you get asked a lot, particularly challenged. These satellites are amazing. I love getting everything from space. Why do we need to care about astronomy? And there's kind of four areas of significance that we're bothered about. So there's the scientific. Astronomy is the oldest human science. We've been doing it for thousands of years. Ever since humans came out of the cave, they looked up at the night sky and wondered what was there. And by looking at the sky, we've basically begun to understand our world, our solar system, our universe, and our place in that universe. We wouldn't know that the Earth goes around the sun without looking into the night sky. We know the planets in our solar system. We know planets around other solar systems by looking at the night sky. We've been able to look further afield. We could see the universe. And our fundamental theories of how the universe exists happens because of astronomy and because we look at the night sky. And it's not just convoluted theories that people think doesn't affect their daily lives. There's observations that happen in astronomy that are really important to how we live our lives. So space weather, there was recently a solar storm which affected particularly Northern Hemisphere. Across Europe, it was certainly a problem in the United Kingdom. And it showed some beautiful lights in the sky, but it also had impacts on satellites, on electricity grids, and other real impacts. And large solar storms can have real impacts on our society and cause real catastrophes. And by using astronomy and observing the night sky and looking at the effects of the basically interplanetary, the near-Earth environment, we can start predicting and managing these effects. So there's a direct effect there. And also, so look back very far in time, the dinosaurs generally accepted were killed by an asteroid. And planetary protection is a concern that people do have. You know, we do regularly, in the order of hundreds of thousands of millions of years, be hit by asteroids. And we need to be able to see them. And part of that is observing the night sky and looking for them. So that's just the scientific significance. But there's technological significance. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. We don't build these brilliant telescopes and instruments. By developing them, there's new technology. So your smartphones, the cameras on your smartphones fundamentally come from the technology built in their professional telescopes and the detectors. Wi-Fi and the ability to get very weak signals and use them in communications comes from astronomy. There's a new telescope being built called the Vera Rubin Astronomy in Chile, and it's effectively going to collect more data than any other experiment any humanity has ever completed. It's collecting so much data, in fact, that we've had to invent new ways to store data and new ways to transfer and move data, new communications techniques, and these will trickle down into society. So the money that goes into space science and into astronomy isn't just thrown into space, into the sky. It helps society every day. beyond the professional, there's a social significance. And you started off saying, look at the night sky. And the basic human natural night sky has been inspiring humanity. It inspires art, it inspires people for education. So there's a huge social significance with that. And also there's a cultural significance. Indigenous peoples often use the night sky for storytelling. There's religious requirements from the night sky, and particularly ritual timekeeping happens with just the natural night sky in astronomy. And there's even economic impacts. Growing industry is dark sky ecotourism, being able to go to remote areas and look at the night sky. And that has particularly benefited developing in rural areas, allowing people to build economies within their community without having to travel to urban areas. So there's a development element there. And then finally, there's the environmental, a really hot topic in general. There's the space environment itself. So satellites in space can have an effect. But our natural environment often relies on the night sky. So a lot of animals rely on the night sky for migration, for stars, for being able to orientate themselves. And there's even some preliminary research that high levels of moving objects in the night sky can have a disorienting effect on animals and humans, perhaps for dizziness and some kind of disorientation there. So there's a range of effects of significance that the night sky matters to all of humanity as well as the professional community.
Okay, that's a great intro. I really love it. Let me dismantle a bit what you just said and challenge that. You started off with what we achieve from the night sky to learn and know about our place in the universe, literally, so that we are moving, that we are not a fixed star. So Galileo, Copernicus, and the other guys. Fine, done. We know that today. So we don't need anyone to tell us today and to make a research. We know it. It's in the book. So check. Space weather. I got it. But we have satellites for doing that, for observing that. We have our recent ESA missions sent out to observe that further. The same for asteroid impacts or planetary defense. So for planetary defense, we have also satellites that are looking above the atmosphere through the night sky to detect that. And animals, okay, I see it. But I would argue that any kind of light pollution and LED light in the cities has a bigger effect than any swarm of asteroids or any forms of satellites in the night skies can have on animals. So that is where I'm coming from. So maybe I'm totally wrong. Help me to understand where the concerns is. And I deliberately didn't touch on the indigenous community and the storytelling and the religion on it. So that is something what I think can't be discussed. But all the others, I would like to have your view on it.
Some great challenges there. I suppose the first thing I'd say is, yes, we know the state of science as we know it now, but that's no indication of what we're going to know in the future and the science we don't know. And science is building up. And in fact, the aim is to disprove current theories. And you do that by continual investigation. So we can't predict what we're going to know in the future. And in fact, it leads into your second comment there about space weather, but it's a common challenge that's brought about astronomy itself is why don't we just move it into space? Why don't we just stop doing terrestrial astronomy and do it beyond these satellites? And then it's not impacted. Which we do. Hubble Space Telescope is in space. Now, Hubble is actually low enough that the satellites above it and it's still impacted. So we can't go near Earth space. We have to go further out. But if you look at where James Webb Space Telescope is, for example, that's about 1.5 million kilometers from the Earth. And that is not affected by satellite constellation. It also costs around $12 million. Whereas I can do good science in my back garden for about $3,000. So there's a huge balance there. There's a range of technical, realistic challenges that mean, yes, of course, we want space telescopes and we want lots of them, as many as you can possibly build and provide, but it's highly unlikely there'll ever be enough to meet the demands of terrestrial science. It's highly unlikely the practical problems of even getting all that data back to Earth and accessing it will exist. And it's just much more efficient, much cheaper. The cost of the largest terrestrial telescopes in the world are in the order of 2 or 3 billion, so a quarter of the price of James Webb. And if they break, you can go and fix them. You can't do that with James Webb Space Telescope.
Is that the price of the ELT you mentioned before?
Yeah, I think it's about 3 billion all up compared to the 12 billion of James Webb, for example. It's just not practical to move astronomy into space. And there is always going to be a terrestrial demand. And sometimes there's just no benefits. I'm sure we'll talk about different types of astronomy. But for some types of astronomy, you can do it just as well on the Earth as you can in space. So why go to the expense of the trouble in what is a hard environment? Yep, space weather, again, it's about quantity. It's about having enough satellites. Missions observing the sun, missions observing the environment are important. But to be able to have the quantity and constant observation of the sky, again, looking for asteroids, is just not practical in space. So you end up being reliant on terrestrial astronomy. And your final point was about animals and the impact on animals. And you're saying how bright cities are. And cities are bright, but cities actually are a very small part of the global terrestrial surface. And animals don't always live there. So you're affecting things away from the urban environment. You're actually affecting the urban environment as well. It adds to the background light sky. It adds to the light pollution that happens for humanity and for animals that live in urban areas. But whole swathes of the world are not around cities. So they are actually relatively pristine.
Got your point. Maybe you can summarize what the concerns are and what is then based on that concerns. What is the Dark and Quiet Sky Initiative?
Okay, so the concerns then. So I'll focus on really what the effects are of these constellations. So since 1957, since Sputnik, we've been launching singular satellites doing specific missions in small numbers. And over time, the number of satellites increased, but often to do specific missions. And I think by around 2009, there was 1,000 operational satellites doing almost 1,000 missions. A few would work together, but generally separate. By 10 years later, 2019, there was about 2,000 operational satellites. So we're taken from 1957 to 2009 to get to 1,000 operational. Another 10 years got us to 2,000 operational satellites. And from 2019 until 2014, so that in 5 years, in half the time, we doubled and doubled again. So there are around 8,000 operational satellites now. And the reason that's happened is because of mega constellations, which is large numbers of satellites, often operated by the same operator, doing the same job, working together. And the reason you often need so many satellites is because they're in very low Earth orbit, they're close to the Earth, so you need a constant stream of satellites. And the leading competitor, the leading commercial operator of this is SpaceX with a Starlink constellation. And this is effectively the majority of satellites in space are in this single constellation now. And it's providing broadband internet to the Earth. So effectively, if you had a dish out in my garden now, I could connect to the internet or almost anywhere in the world and get high-speed internet connectivity. And this has changed the population in space. So back in 2019, it was about 50% of satellites were very close to the Earth, in the order of hundreds, 500 to 1,000, 2,000 kilometers. And about 50% were out in geostationary orbit, so they were a fixed place just under 40,000 kilometers from the Earth. And the dynamic has completely changed now, where 90% are in low Earth orbit, and they're much closer. And this is where the problem starts to come, because you've now got a constant movement of sky, flights across the sky. There are two key impacts, really, astronomical impacts. So the first one is radio interference. And that was the initial concern at the start of the space age, was that all these satellites have to transmit some kind of frequency. Otherwise, if you're not communicating with your satellites, you're not going to get data. So it's pretty essential. And this transmission then would cause interference with terrestrial astronomy as it goes along. So that was the first real concern. And it was engaged with as part of the discussions with the United Nations, with the International Telecommunications Union, as part of the licensing. And it was discussed to say that, okay, there'll be certain protective frequencies for radio astronomy that you're not allowed to transmit in. Relatively small amounts of the general electromagnetic spectrum, but these are protected.
What frequency are we talking about? Because as you said, that's clearly regulated by the ITU.
Yeah, so it's relatively low frequencies, in the order of tens of megahertz. There's a few specific bands and ranges where it's covered, and that because they match astronomical and interesting radio emissions. So we didn't want them polluted at all. Beyond the protected radio bands, when a satellite operator applies to work, they have to apply for a license for frequency. And then it's effectively a negotiation in that, yes, you can use this frequency, but then you've got to manage how your power levels, and you don't interfere with each other. And it's almost, you could call it a competition, but I prefer to say it's a bit of a discussion on how we manage it. Similar to this, they established radio quiet zones around terrestrial radio astronomy. So effectively, there's a negotiation with the host country. There's an area around these observatories where you're not allowed to transmit. So if I go to Jodrell Bank, which is just up the road here in Manchester, you can't have your mobile phone on, so you can't do interference. And that worked quite well for quite a long time. And although there was interference from satellites as they go across, it was very much along a single band where they are in geostationary. And any low Earth orbit satellites would fly overhead quite rapidly. There wouldn't be that many of them, so you wouldn't have a great deal. You could manage and mitigate it. But that's changed with the quantity of satellites. And there are now so many satellites now, and the demand for spectrum in space is so much that you're becoming closer and closer. You chop it up into smaller and smaller bandwidths, and you're starting to get leakage across. So there's actually interference between these bands. No antenna is perfect. They point it in the direction they want the signal to go, but there's always leakage from the back and the sides, and that starts to interfere. But beyond that, there's even issues in the protected bands. So these are supposedly protected. You're not allowed to transmit them at all. But there's been recent studies where there has been the components on board a spacecraft, all electrical components leak some kind of noise, some kind of electromagnetic interference, generally unmodulated. But traditionally, that wasn't a problem on a satellite because it'd be a generally unique satellite. It wouldn't have a specific copied signature, so there'd only be one or maybe a couple of them, and it'd very rarely pass over you. If you've got thousands of exactly the same mass-produced satellites, you've now got a constant stream of the same interference. And this has been detected in the actual frequency bands that are protected. And there's no regulation to stop this because there's no requirement to do any testing before you launch. Any concerns about electromagnetic radiation or interference are the satellite with itself or the satellite with the launcher during launch when it probably doesn't have most of its equipment turned on. So that's becoming a real common problem with mass-produced, effectively identical satellites. A second problem in the radio spectrum is reflected emissions. So the satellites have a profile. There are radio quiet zones where the telescopes are. You shouldn't interfere. And a recent example was the Graves space radar in France. So a military radar looking into space is geographically separated from a LOFAR radio observatory in the Netherlands, shouldn't interfere with it. And it's been detected that the transmissions from the radar are bouncing off the satellite and coming back into the radio quiet zone. So there are now no radio quiet zones either. And there's no legislation on protecting radio quiet zones from satellites. There are for planes have to route around them. You can't run a business that runs 100 washing machines that give out an electrical signal right next to it. But satellites going overhead, there's no regulation. So this is becoming a real concern now, terrestrially on the radio spectrum. The one that you've probably seen and heard of, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of, is the optical spectrum now, physically seeing these satellites. And that's a quite impressive and spectacular impact. So very few satellites have light on them. The ISS has a few lights for docking, the International Space Station, but most satellites are actually have no lights on them. And the light you're seeing off them is then being illuminated by the sun. So you're in your position on the Earth, it's gone night, the sun's gone along the horizon, you're after sunset, but the satellite itself is still in the sun and you're seeing the reflected sunlight. And the most common example of this it's called a string of pearls. You may have heard with the Starlink satellites quite soon after launch. They keep them in a relatively low orbit and they do the initial testing to make sure everything works. And they're going in a line like a bit of a train, one after each other. And people saw this string of pearls across the sky and thought it was amazing. And it's inspiring. Look at this, something humanity's made into the sky. But these are becoming more common. You're starting to get more satellites. And in fact, if you actually look at the long term, there's potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of satellites in the sky, whereas this now won't be an isolated incident. This would be a common occurrence in the sky, almost wherever you look, potentially. And that's just for the natural night sky. You could see with your naked eye. Astronomers want to see very faint, distant objects, and they have to point their telescopes at them for a very long time to be able to collect enough photons and be able to see it. And the problem with that is you then get satellites streaking across. So you take in a picture, you take a long exposure picture, the satellite makes a streak across it. One wouldn't be a problem, and that's commonly happened. So traditionally, optical astronomers weren't generally concerned about satellites because you could always say, I'll take 10 pictures. If there's a satellite in one of them, I've got 9 pictures. Everything's good. But if it comes to the point where you've constantly got satellites in every picture on them, most pictures are in, you then can't replace that data. And for some astronomical objects, when you're looking at supernovae and planets going in front of their star, you're trying to observe them, this is a time-specific activity that you can't just redo again later. So you've basically lost that science forever by the transmission. And even in the worst case, the brightest satellites, because we're trying to see very dim stars and very dim astronomical objects, the brightest satellites are so bright that they physically damage the detector. So there's real concerns in both the radio and optical domain, which is the core of the terrestrial astronomy, on the impacts of constellations, but for different reasons.
So, and the Dark and Quiet Skies initiatives are trying to regulate that? Or so what is the idea? Or to just introduce this problem? I think that's where we start. You just made this very eloquent through the different scenarios, but for the layperson like me, it's invisible. So I didn't know about the radio frequency disturbance of the astronomical band. The satellite in the picture, sure, that's something we have seen, as you mentioned, that made it to the press. What is this initiative now?
So even radio astronomy has more of an impact. There's a particular observation that happens in radio astronomy of very distant objects that's used to effectively fix our GPS and the positioning you use every single day in your life. The financial markets rely on the timing, but because the Earth's in motion and isn't perfectly spherical, you need an external fixed regulation of time. And that's what you get from astronomy. So the global position system, and whenever you order a pizza and it's delivered, you're using astronomy in your life every single day. So to go into the general Dark and Quiet Skies initiative then, obviously this has developed over time. As I said, initially it was concerned by radio astronomers, but it's become more and more of an issue for visual and optical astronomers. So there's been a number of national and international organizations that have started to raise this problem. And the point of raising this problem is, like every single environmental problem, is you want to address it at the start. The longer you leave these problems, it starts becoming harder and harder. You've seen this with climate change. You've seen this with impacts across the ecology and the environment on Earth. The longer you leave it, the harder it is to rectify. So the hope is that we can, at the start of what is going to be a new space age, where we're going to get more and more services from space, that we can start to influence and protect the things that matter to us while enabling these amazing technologies. And they are amazing technologies. So a number of initiatives have been raised to try and better understand the problem, to identify and clarify all these concerns, and then raise them with key stakeholders, governments, international organizations, satellite operators, and the wider public. As you said, you've seen the satellites, the sugar pills that were inspired by it, but didn't realize the wider consequences, and the radio domain is effectively invisible. So it's a standalone agenda on the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So it started to be discussed in international organizations. And one leading non-governmental organization is the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, and that recently established a Centre for the Protection of Dark and Quiet Skies from Satellite Interference, snappily titled, let's call it the CPS, IAU CPS. And effectively, that's an international group of experts and stakeholders that work on this problem through 4 key hubs. So there's the Sat Hub, which organizes public observation so we can see how bright these satellites are, and looking at technical ways to minimize or mitigate the impact. So how can we stop this being a problem technically by new software, by predictions? There's the Industry and Technology Hub. Obviously, particularly commercial operators are focusing on their business, and they just want to get their technology deployed. They want to start getting the revenue from it. So the industry hub starts liaising with these stakeholders and gives them advice and guidance on how they can better deploy their spacecraft, how they can operate them better, how they can minimize these effects while still getting the benefits. The community engagement hub is important, and effectively that's what we're doing today. We're discussing community engagement to raise awareness of this problem so people can start becoming engaged and highlighting things that impact them, which astronomers may not have thought of, because I'm sure there's plenty of people in the world who do care about the night sky. And then the final one is the policy hub, which provides a guidance on best practice, international regulation, and anything else to support the discussion and allow evidence-based decisions to be made. They've recently released a call to protect the dark and quiet sky. So that's a plain language summary of the concerns and a range of recommendations and guidance. And that's astronomers. How do astronomers better manage their observations in order to protect them from satellite interference, but also for constellation operators, giving guidance on recommended altitude limits, operational behavior and technology, and then lawmakers as well. So what you can bring in as part of your licensing and legislation process to say, before we give you a license, we expect you to conduct reflection testing or emission testing so we can understand the level. So there's a growing group of organizations that are engaging with this problem and are engaging with satellite providers and having some effects depending on the provider and depending on their willingness to engage with the problem.
It's interesting. I saw a post today that you and Copius just released a report from the last session, I think 2 months back, where I had the pleasure to also be present. Tell me, we had these concerning developments over the last years with SpaceX, as you mentioned. So this curve of ramping up their operational satellites to, I think, about their own 6,000, 8,000 right now, out of the 10,000 that are operational that you mentioned before. The number changed literally by the day. That happens for quite some time. And I was made aware of this issue with one of your posts earlier this week, where you pointed to AST and the direct-to-device capabilities that they want to establish. So what changed from SpaceX now to AST?
So effectively, it's a different way to solve a problem. So the SpaceX Starlink network, as it is up to now, almost entirely has done effectively broadband internet. So that's you having your own dish, you having your own capability that you point at the sky and you get internet in your home or in your RV if you were to pay or on your ship. So it's like a fixed internet provision. So the change that's happening that involves AST and SpaceX, in fact, is the delivery of direct-to-device communications, often called direct-to-cell because people think about smartphones and cell phones. And effectively, instead of having a separate, unique piece of equipment that you buy, a dish that you point at the sky, it's trying to connect your average smartphone, you commercially buy that you connect into your normal terrestrial 5G, 4G network, connecting that to satellites with enough connectivity and enough bandwidth so that you can do all the operations you want to do on your smartphone, look at cat memes on Twitter, or to be able to do it with enough low power so it doesn't just drain your battery. And actually for the user, the idea is that it's seamless. You don't know if you're a local telephone mast, a local cellular mast, or whether you'll move onto a satellite depending on the coverage or the capacity of the area. So this is a really growing industry and possibly might be the biggest driver for constellations in the future, because 80% of the world have some kind of mobile access, not all 5G. Well, that still leaves over 1.5 billion customers, the amount of people in the world. But 80% of the world is not covered by mobile access because most people live in cities and towns. So there's a relatively large market of people who aren't correctly served and a huge geographical area of people who aren't served. And the ability to connect them is often prohibitive. You'll have to lay hundreds of kilometers of cable and masts and power to be able to connect 1 or 2 users in a remote farm in a remote area. So commercially, it's not really worthwhile to do it terrestrially, but from space, you can. The problem you've got with this is instead of having your own dish and your own equipment that's plugged into your local mains power, you've now got a very small smartphone with a very small antenna and a very small battery. So effectively, the link budget, the responsibility to make that connection, moves from the user, the space segment. So the satellite has to make up the difference. There are 2 ways to do this effectively. One is the way SpaceX are going. So they're currently in the process with the American licensing authorities to amend their constellation designs. So they now want to change it to generation 2, which has 20,000 satellites in very low Earth orbit, so in the region of 340 to 360 kilometers in this case, and then 10,000 in what is their traditional orbit of 500-600 kilometers. And the reason they're putting the majority so much closer is because the closer you are to the user, the less power you need. So you're making up the deficiency in your user by bringing the satellite closer. And they've already started doing that, and in fact, they have 130-something satellites. It would have been 146, but there was 2 launches planned yesterday. The one where the booster failed included 13 direct-to-start satellites, which then cancelled the second launch, which would have happened. So there would have been 2 launches of 13 satellites yesterday. So that's the SpaceX way of doing it. And although there's concerns with the amount of satellites and how they're doing it, actually by going lower is within the recommendations of the guidelines. The IAU CPS guidelines suggest that to try operate below 600 kilometers if you can. And that looks like what the majority of SpaceX are doing. So although not perfect, it's actually better the lower they go. AST Space Mobile are a different commercial company who want to do exactly the same thing, but they're effectively solve the problem in a different way. SpaceX have gone lower. By going lower, you need more satellites and a lot of satellites for the capacity. AST Space Mobile have decided to launch their Bluebird satellites, which are in a higher orbit, but they need less of them. But because they're in a higher orbit and they still want to be able to have millions of subscribers in order to be commercially viable, and they still want to be able to minimize the problems with this very low power handset, they need these huge antennas. And in fact, 65 square meters was their prototype Blue Walker 3. So a very large antenna. And there's currently 5 Bluebird, which are their operational satellites. The first 5 of around 250 satellite constellation that they want to launch that are ready to go now. And in fact, if SpaceX wasn't grounded, they could happen quite soon. And even beyond that, because of the success and the funding they've raised, they're now looking at having over a 200 square meter antenna. So 4 times the size of the one we've already seen in their next generation of satellites. So the prototype we've already seen was at a visual magnitude of 0.4. And what that means to a non-astronomer is that it's one of the brightest things in the night sky. So the prototype was one of the brightest things in the night sky, brighter than almost every star. And if you've now got hundreds of them that are possibly even bigger, it becomes a real problem. And they've done that further away because they need it to be able to close this link budget. So it's 2 ways of solving the problem. Both come with issues, but AST Space Mobile, the way they're solving it is a particular concern because you've got very high satellites, comparatively higher than the IAU guidance, and very large, bright satellites.
What is the altitude?
So the AST Space Mobile constellation is at around 750 kilometers. In the grand scheme of things, still quite low, but above the 600 kilometer recommendation. And the higher satellites are, the worse it is for terrestrial astronomy.
Okay. I think now it's time for the killer question. So how do you balance these technical advancements, the new technologies that we all love? Most of us have a mobile. Most of us love the smartphone applications. Most of us want to be connected wherever we go. So we love these technical advancements over the time. They're coming on the operator side with commercial interests, and those are now confronted with the policy regime and a few guys that are coming up with a strange idea of preserving what we have. How do you balance that? I think there's no right or wrong. No one of us wants to go back to the Stone Age or the Stone Age of internet, so before smartphones developed. I mean, I remember my parents were happy to have a wired phone at home, so I was a king. I was available, but it's nothing compared to what we're talking today. And I think that's not the intent. So the question is, what is the right balance in that?
I think it's a good question. And I suppose the first thing to understand from the perspective of the astronomical community is that nobody wants to stop this technology. It's often discussed in the way that you only care about your astronomy, you're trying to stop progress, there's these great technologies. Astronomers are people too. We absolutely want to use this technology. And in fact, beyond just connecting somebody up with their cellular phone, the opportunities of direct-to-cell and direct-to-device technology are amazing. In a world that we're going to have driverless automated cars, the ability to connect and exchange information will be fantastic for safety. You look at climate change, being able to put small, low-powered devices all over the world means you've got a constant monitoring of them. So we absolutely want to enable that technology. And as you could tell, I'm a fan. I'm enthusiastic. And I think satellite operators and those who want to build this technology and deliver it for us need to understand that astronomers want to work with them. It's not us and them. It's absolutely an engagement to find out the best practice. And there will be give and take. There will be mitigations that happen with astronomers, but it requires information sharing. So just as a simple example, if satellite providers provide exact positional information that's readily updated of their satellites, astronomers will try to avoid it. They'll identify when they want to look at a target, how long they want to look at it for, and when there won't be a satellite there. So just that simple information sharing can really help. Active engagement in how you can physically change this, that might be through operational procedures, orienting spacecraft in certain ways so they don't reflect as much. So it has very minimal impacts on your activity, but you just think about the environment you're working in at very minimal cost. Practical activities. So being able to test your spacecraft for reflectivity, for emissions, conducting these tests before you go, and then taking action will prevent an issue down the line. And SpaceX, obviously, we speak about them a lot, and we speak about the Starlink constellation a lot because they're the market leader, but they're not the only one. But they really have engaged with the problem. And they've done a number of activities. So they had a bright antenna on the bottom of the satellite. They painted it black. They called it DarkSat, and it did stop it being as bright. It also made it far too hot, and that didn't work. They then had a visor on a satellite in order to protect the reflection, which worked really well. It stopped it being so bright, but it also increased the drag, and the satellite didn't work very well. They're currently testing a specific mirror that tries to deflect it. So there's technological responses that maybe we can have space standards that become the norm of behavior, and we remove this problem. And if we work together, I think we can solve these problems. But it takes engagement from the space community in good faith and the passage of information and willingness to try and resolve this.
If we look now into the future, and I'm talking about the future defined by the ITU filings, because that's where we know what number of satellite we can expect in the years to come. Then we are talking about 30, 50,000 very easily on the constellations you just mentioned. We talk about eSpace coming from Rwanda with their 330,000. So I'm a bit careful with that number, but we have the Chinese constellation and so on and so forth. So take fivefold the active satellites that we see today, which will be then the 50,000. How could that scenario, even everyone played by the recommendations you just mentioned, how could a scenario like that be something that works for an astronomer? Would it?
So the numbers are spectacular. You speak about the ITU filings. If you add up all the ITU filings, it's over 1 million satellites.
Honestly, yeah.
Over 1 million. So I don't believe 1 million satellites or that million satellites will be launched. I think a lot of it is about securing spectrum and certain effectively intellectual property rights. But if only 1 or 2% of them satellites were launched, we're still talking tens of thousands of satellites. So I think your estimate of 50, 60, maybe up to 100,000 satellites in the next decade or so is not unrealistic. It is potential. If action isn't taken on the dark and quiet skies, that would be catastrophic. Everywhere we look, there would be a satellite. There would be thousands overhead at any time. That's in the optical. In the radio, there would constantly be radio signals and noise and background that's happening. It would be catastrophic for terrestrial astronomy with all the issues and all the problems that I've discussed earlier on. If everybody took precautions, if everybody engaged with that, if they pass out the information, clearly there's only so much pointing you can do if there's thousands of satellites in the sky. You're going to have to live with it. There would be degradations, there would be problems. But if you take responsibility, if you test your satellites, if you try and minimize the impacts, we can all work together and we can save the natural night sky, we can save the scientific night sky, and hopefully have the balance where we get this amazing technology and we can connect to the internet on our phones no matter where we are in the world, but we also keep all the astronomical, technological, social, environmental benefits that we get.
What is the way forward? I mean, one potential way forward could be you're looking for a new job because as an astronomer in this environment, we just drop. There's not so much to do, but I think that's not an option or in your way. So what is the way forward for us as society, for the policymakers in that field?
So I suppose it's awareness and engaging in the conversation, not ignoring it, not just deploying it. The rate of pace of change and the deployment is such that legislation is just really struggling to catch up. And in fact, in the global geopolitical environment we've got, the ability to define international legislation is probably quite limited at the moment. You're going to struggle to get everybody to agree. But what you can start doing is responsible behavior. You can start establishing norms. You can have discussions and conversations. You can raise pressure and awareness. So by getting this message out, letting people understand now what the problem is, because it'll be too late when suddenly the night sky's full. You're probably not going back to the Stone Age, as you said. So having the conversation, raising the awareness, having responsible satellite operators, demonstrating good behavior can still give you all the benefits you want, and that it's not commercially destructive, I think is the start of where we go. And hopefully we can then have a night sky and this amazing technology.
Great. Ian, thank you very much for your time. It was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. That's for me the most important point. Thank you and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global. and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.